I'm actually here under a completely different title because I'm no longer no, it's my fault for not saying it, but I'm not the vice whatever it was, chair of Stop the War. I'm still a member of Stop the War, but I stood down from this illustrious position, so I'm still capable of making an argument. I want to thank both speakers who spoke in front of me. I thought, Phil, the piece that you read was absolutely astonishing. And in many ways, it's this thing that I suppose I want to say about Neil's speech, is when he ends up saying that in fact the war was finished because of the actions of soldiers and their families on both the Eastern Front, and the danger for the German army that in fact it was going to break out, as it was breaking out in Berlin and many of the towns in Germany itself. The thing that we don't know is why it is that in 1918 those stories were not more important and remained as important as they should have done over the intervening 90 years, whatever it is. I want to start with two quotes. The first is about the First World War. It's 2 years before the First World War. In 1912, 1913, there were two Balkan Wars. And a man called Leon Trotsky, who we know from other areas, was in fact a journalist at the time, and he was commenting on, he was writing reports from the front throughout the wars. And for anybody who wants to read anything about what wars and how wars impact on people, the Balkan Wars, which is a collection of his articles, are absolutely astonishing. I mean, they are both moving but also analytical. And one of them was, he interviewed a Turkish prisoner. So it was the Balkans, it was between the Ottoman Empire and some of the aspirant nationalists who were fighting. But this Turkish prisoner is interviewed, and he says, "We went off on manoeuvres. We never thought of going to war, and only at the last minute did we learn there was going to be a war, and that the Bulgars were very close. Did we want a war? How can anyone want it? War is a fearful thing. It's impossible to want a war. It's like death. We were absolutely unprepared, but we weren't worried because we were on manoeuvres." But then it turned out that it wasn't so. And that clearly was what the experiences of very large numbers of people throughout history have been. That the people who are fighting knew nothing about what it was about, where it was from, why they were doing it, and certainly in this case, and in many cases, would not have known that it was actually about to be a war. They put on the uniform to do manoeuvres and then suddenly find they're at the front. Now the other quote is from 1917, and it's a very different man. It's a man who in fact was Lord Lansdowne, who was a former Tory Foreign Secretary, and he wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph, this is in 1917, calling for a negotiated peace. And in it he says, now this is something that of course nobody in that ruling class would have done, to send a letter demanding a negotiation. And his argument was the following, part of it: "We're not going to lose this war, but its promulgation will spell ruin for the civilized world, and an infinite addition to the load of human suffering which already weighs upon it. Just as this war has been more dreadful than any war in history, we may be sure that the next war will be even more dreadful than this. The prostitution of science for the purpose of pure destruction is not likely to stop short." Now, of course, the response to him was, basically, how dare you send a letter like this? It's a completely unpopular thing amongst the ruling class. But his precedent was very, very evident. Poison gas, guns, all different types of ordnance, tanks and other things were being used on the First World War battlefields. But of course they were followed by weapons of increasing size, more effective mobility, and unanticipated technologies. But I want to just compare the First World War and the present period of the last, say, 20 or 30 years. The first is there are huge similarities. In that whole period, and Neil's right, if you think about it from below, it was a class society. But the key thing was that it was capitalist. Every single state in Europe was a capitalist state. Clearly not the same sort of capitalism that we have today. They were in almost beginnings of industrial capital. Certainly huge numbers of people were involved in agriculture, masses of people were involved in very small factories and things. But there was clearly a capitalist economy. Now, why is that important? Because it's exactly the same in the present day. Whichever state we're looking at, even China is, without doubt, the supreme capitalist country. What we've got to consider is, why is that important? Because I would argue that actually one of the things about capitalism is that in fact there is almost an energy within it that demands warfare, demands aggression. Because, and one's got to consider this, if we think about what capital is, it's got to carry on accumulating, it's got to carry on producing and getting profits. It has that urgency all the time. We all listen to the radio every morning and it's something about, well, this year it's only 0.5% growth. And we need 2% growth or 3% growth. And it's 3% every single year. It's a geometrical sort of increase that they're wanting. So it's expansive. If it doesn't expand, there is a crisis. There is a massive crisis. Therefore, it's got to carry on doing that. And clearly in the First World War, the period of the First World War, and Neil explained this, you end up having all of these states, all of these capitalist countries, competing with each other. And they're competing for markets, for resources, for secure territory, for buffer states, for, I mean, the Solomon Islands. How many of you know where the Solomon Islands are? One. Hi, that's one. Two people know. The Solomon Islands are a group of islands in the Pacific, right? In 1880, they were Spanish. The Spanish Empire was collapsing by this time, and it became an area that was divided between Britain and Germany. For what reasons? Key would have been, it wasn't necessarily resources. It was the whole thing about why, for example, the British grabbed hold of the Falklands or any other place. They were areas that in fact were linking all the sort of naval routes. And they were key. And those sort of things, of course, mean that imperialism, capitalism expanding out in lots of ways was absolutely key at that period. The other thing, of course, is that ended up the First World War, and this is the difference. The First World War was, certainly in Europe, was a world of kings, emperors, tsars, whatever. I mean, it was almost like a post-feudal sort of ruling class, where you had all of these people, and you only 2 or 3 years before the First World War started, so it was something like 1911. All of these kings and emperors and tsars and everybody else all gathered together for funerals of one of them. So it wasn't as though they were actually, fighting each other at that moment. It was something where this class was Europe-wide. They were related, all of them were related. And it is one of the things that I think one's got to be so conscious of, is that the interests that each of them had were recognizing each other's interests, but at the same time they were national. They had to ensure that their particular state was going to maintain its own power and increase its power. Now, there is somebody shot in June 1914, we all know this, and by August, war had started. And I think one's got to ask why. It was an immensely swift mobilization. There were illusions in lots of people. It was going to be a quick war, it's going to be very fast. You would end up being able to shoot the others, they wouldn't ever shoot you. I mean, it's all this mentality of not understanding what it is when people are actually sort of driven into that situation. It was also the belief that your state, this was true of Britain, it was true of Germany, was that in fact, for example, your cavalry was really sort of more superb than everybody else. The fact that you were going to be facing things like barbed wire, or tanks, or different types of weaponry, of course, meant that those sort of, it was a sort of chaotic moment where you had technologies that were feudal or post-feudal against industrial weaponry. And again, Neil said this, it was an industrializing war. It became more and more industrializing. And of course, the numbers of deaths. But I suppose the other thing that is really crucial is the fact that in 1914, all the links that had been made across Europe for the Social Democrats, and the Social Democratic Party in Germany was huge. It was very well organized. It was, in fact, a culture of socialism. Admittedly, it was social democratic. It wasn't necessarily revolutionary, but there were revolutionaries within it. And they were immensely well organized. And what did all of these parties do year after year after year? They passed resolutions at their conferences saying that, in fact, they are in favor of peace. They're in favor of peace, and if there is a danger of war, what they must do is organize general strikes and every sort of opposition to it. And what happened in July 1914? Every single one of those parties collapsed in the face of the danger of war. You've got people like Jaurès, who is French anti-war, who is assassinated 2 days before the war starts. Keir Hardie, a minority thrown out, in a sense, from the party. The German Social Democratic Party had something like 98 or 88 members of parliament, and they held a meeting prior to the vote about war, and something like 18 of them voted against war. And because of the convention, that party went back into the parliament and had a unified position. It didn't say there's a minority of 18. And the person who had to make the statement was one of their deputies, who in fact was anti-war. And he had to say, we're voting in favour of the war. So it meant that, in fact, that whole collapse of an opposition, and of course, as soon as you have that, and when war conditions occur, it becomes immensely difficult to organise politically in anything like that, unless you're prepared to do something. So that was something that 1914-18 was really a crisis. And amazingly, given the sort of conditions that were being faced in places like Russia, in places like Germany, you did end up having complete fracturing socially and politically in those states. But the other thing, of course, is there were people who opposed the war. And we know that. There were people like, for example, Keir Hardie, Jaurès. Debs, Eugene Debs in the States was anti-war. And he was in prison from 1917 to 1920 for his anti-war activities. Bertrand Russell in prison for 6 months. Somebody who was really agonizing all the time about whether he should be a patriot or not. But his position in the end came out against war. And then you've got a series of people. I mean, there is a very, very good book, To End All Wars, it's called, by Adam Hochschild. And it is a recounting of how, in fact, people were trying to organize. And yes, there were something like 20,000 conscientious objectors in Britain. But there were some people who, in fact, were also helping to organize to try and, get some sort of opposition created inside the army itself. There was, of course, a very sterling conference held in 1915, where those parties, the rump parties very often, who were opposed to the war, all met and produced a statement opposing war. But it was a sort of heroic gesture, in a sense. It was very, very impossible to see very much coming out of that. And who were the victors? I mean, this is the thing that I think is quite incredible, is you listen to British historians today talking about the fact that Britain was victorious in 1918. The number of people who were killed, the number of people who were maimed, the number of people who were traumatized, the number of families that had to live with the fact that, in fact, they were carrying the burden of that war. So it wasn't a question of victory. And then, of course, you look through the 1920s. The victors, so-called, the rulers of those victorious powers, then enact all sorts of conditions so that you had the reparations on Germany and all the other states, which in the end create a complete social breakdown in many ways, and political crises right the way through the 1920s and 30s. So for many people, it wasn't that the war finished in 1918. It continued, in a sense, into the Second World War and went on to 1945. But what is the difference today? After, I think, the last, really, I mean, if we look at the last 20 years, one thing is that there is much, much more information available to people. Partly it's about education. Mass education is something that's been crucially important. The huge amount of books that are read and written. But the other thing, of course, is things like the internet and the possibility of being able to communicate much, much more quickly. The idea that, in fact, what you had, and we all remember this, 2001, if I ask you what happened on that day, you could give me the account of how you heard, what you saw, etc. on the day, on September the 11th. And what happened immediately afterwards? With suddenly the President of the United States, who had been reading a book upside down to these primary children, suddenly disappears, right? Nobody knows where he is. And then, 2 or 3 days later, there is suddenly the announcement that in fact Afghanistan is going to be bombed. Did it take 4 years to do it? It took less than 4 days. What was happening at that time? The efficiency of weaponry. It's exactly what Lansdowne had said was important about what was going to happen. The sophistication of weapons. You had daisy cutters being dropped on mountains that were completely bare. Within 4 days, the American pilots were saying to their controllers, there isn't anything more to bomb. That is the way you destroy a state. That is what you do to destroy a country. That is what you do to, in the end, create a real anger and hatred for what you are doing to them. And that's something that all of us know. And it was within a month of that that people were beginning to say, we've got to organise to do something. Because it wasn't just going to be Afghanistan. Because in the time when Bush had disappeared into wherever he went to, for that 2 or 3 days when he'd gone, the discussions in the States was not how are we going to bomb Afghanistan, it's should we bomb Afghanistan or should we bomb Iraq? For what reason? And that's the other thing. You then start thinking, is it about oil? Everybody said no, it wasn't just about oil, and it wasn't. Is it about control of areas? Is it about ensuring that in fact the Americans, who seem to have taken, and I am not making this as a political point, it's just interesting that today in the Financial Times there is a letter saying, everybody's suddenly talking about what the Russians are doing around the Crimea and what an illegal act it is. Did anybody talk about the illegal act on September the 14th, 15th by the Americans? Certainly the Financial Times wasn't carrying statements like that. It was completely accepted. That is something that's quite legitimate. So suddenly international law, whatever this thing is used and bent all different ways. I suppose the other thing that's important about the differences is that we did organise. There was a huge expression of opposition, particularly around Iraq. It wasn't just in Britain, it was every single state. There were big anti-war demonstrations because people did not believe that was the way that you solve political differences. And it's still the same. And it's right. Neil's absolutely right. When, in fact, last summer, it looked as though it was going to be Syria, the effect of the last 10, 12 years on a population, not just in this country, but in the States and in other countries was that we do not want our rulers to go on the same track. It was something very, very clear. We knew last year when the congressmen and women were being inundated on their emails by their constituents saying no to war. That was clear after, what's his name, this man that we have, Cameron, had been forced in the end to actually, to come out and find out whether in fact that's what people wanted. So I suppose there is an element that things are very different today. But we also know they're different in other ways. You've got technology which without doubt is much, much more terrifying. nuclear weapons, which nobody talks about any longer, but are there. They are there, and they can be used, and at some point they may very well be used unless we get rid of them.
Yeah.
We also know that in fact there are now ways of operating on the warfield where in fact you don't have a human being, but you have a drone. And it's not just intelligence, it's also ways of killing. So it's almost like removing everything to the metropolis, and then, you know, you sort of send out things in whatever way you want. But the other thing, and it's interesting, Neil said he thinks the war on terror was sort of, you know, somehow diffused over the last period. I'm not sure it is. I remember what was said when they announced the war on terror. It will be as long as your lifetime. And when you hear that the NSA and others are actually poking around in all our computers, and we know that surveillance is absolutely massive, and we know that the computer and digitalization of all sorts of information is very, very sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated, it isn't that in fact it's easy. But I think one of the things that is important is that the First World War is an example for lots of us about the horror of war. And it is that I think people learned huge lessons from. It is the thing where, in fact, for many of us, and to find out whether, in fact, you've got stories like the one that Neil has been talking about before, is something that I think is massively important. We do end up having to talk and to ensure that people don't. What's the Labour education?
Tristram Hunt.
Well, when Tristram Hunt, that's right, he was debating this question about the war on some television programme. And I was shocked, Richard, because he said he didn't mention the deaths of anybody in it. It was all the question of whether it was a good thing socially, you know, in terms of liberating women eventually or whatever it was. And it ended up, you know, you felt this is insane. The one thing we all knew from wherever we were born in England, or Scotland, or Wales, or France, or Germany, was that there are war memorials for the First World War. And what did they show? The number of people who died. And I mean, it's one of the things that you just look at, the family names, and suddenly realizing that 4 or 5 people from a village with the same name never came back. That's the horror of war, and that's why, in fact, it's all part and parcel of the way that we've got to consider that somewhere this insane system has got to be dismantled. There's a very final quote I want to read to you. It's a very little one, but it's one by, well, I was going to read it. Here's it. It's by Gramsci, and for me, it's a very interesting quote because he says, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. So it's the old systems are decaying, but what we have as a response to them cannot as yet manifest itself. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appears. And war is one of the most morbid of all of these symptoms.